Och programmet har följande hålltider. 22:45 Lilla Sverige.
At the ODA's base in the Croatian port of Metkovic, there is a visible sense of shock and despondency. But despite the brutal death of one of their number, none of Britain's 100-strong contingent of volunteer drivers are thinking of quitting.
I have spoke to all my drivers in Metkovic today, and I've asked if anyone wants to go home. There's been no pressure put on them at all to stay, and they always, one man said, we're staying.
Danger is no stranger. Incidents such as this one last year, when the local fighters disregarded the safety of a convoy and carried on fighting, are commonplace. And when it's not artillery or mortars, it's sniper fire.
Now and then we take the odd round. I think most of the trucks have had a couple. This one's had two in the cab, and that one happened at the Travnik T-junction when I was having a bit of trouble down in Vitez. And this one here around the back was at in Foci.
Yet while the drivers came to terms long ago with such random acts of war, none had ever thought that some of the people they are helping to feed would carry out such calculated, cold-blooded murder.
I can't understand why they're attacking us. We've not, you know, all we're doing is feeding them. We're not here for any other reason apart from help the refugees, and that's it.
For the moment, the British aid effort has been suspended, but at Metkovic's cavernous warehouse, the forklift trucks are still working. The convoys of other nations are still taking the risks and driving into Bosnia. Aernout Van Lynden, Sky News, Metkovic, Croatia. It's still painful, but in the British Battalion's field hospital in Vitez, the two wounded ODA drivers are slowly recovering. They're lucky to be alive, but it was luck of their own making. When the still unknown gunman who had hijacked their car forced them to kneel by a river bank, they saw their colleague Paul Goodall shot in the head, and both dived into the river.
Yeah, I think we both had the same idea, approximately the same time, that the best course of action was to put the water between us and them. And once we got in the water, I don't think either of us knew that the other one was in there at the time. To be quite honest, it was every man for himself at that stage. But approximately 15-20 minutes later, when it turned out that both myself and Simon had survived, I think it was really training that then took over. It was sort of routine, if you like.
Routine only for experienced ex-servicemen. Despite a bullet in the lung, David Court believes the aid effort should continue.
There's a lot of good people getting out here that deserve every support. Why should just a small fraction of the community ruin that for thousands and thousands of people?
In Zenica, where the shooting happened, the police chief says dozens have been detained, amongst them 3 suspects of Middle Eastern origin, yet carrying British, French and Danish passports. No charges have been brought. After initially suspending its convoys, the ODA will now resume the aid effort. It's not just the danger of rogue elements and a bitter war the drivers are up against, but also a bitter winter. The winds and snow so fierce that on Saturday even the UN's armoured vehicles had trouble getting through. Aernout Van Lynden, Sky News, Central Bosnia. Early morning in central Bosnia, and yet again the British forces have come under fire from Croat positions. They missed, but a second warrior of the Coldstream Guards takes up position in search of a target that proves elusive. In Zenica, evidence of a closer call, again the work of the Croats, leaving this driver from the Dutch Transport Battalion deeply shaken. As the soldiers discuss their increasingly uncomfortable predicament, The local UNHCR logistical officer faces a delegation from the nearby town of Visoko. They've come to plea for emergency aid after a particularly fierce Serb artillery barrage the previous morning. The UN civilian goes in search of a UN soldier who can provide the transport, and within minutes it's arranged.
Thank you. Only here to help.
2 British Army trucks are loaded with plastic sheeting, stoves and mattresses, while a complete Dutch convoy is filled with food. By late afternoon, the convoy is unloaded at Visoko's warehouse. For once, an almost immediate response to an urgent plea for aid. In the town centre, they're clearing the rubble, trying to restore some small part of broken, shattered homes. They're used to it, almost numb to it.
It's every day that the Visoko is shelled, you know, and no one speaks about us, because it's about 20 shells and no one cares anymore about that. You know, if it isn't 100, you are not mentioned.
Both the UN civilian and military wings reacted fast to the calls for help from Visoko, but ultimately such missions only highlight the painful truth of the UN's position here. They can patch up people and houses, but don't have the mandate to stop those same people and houses being hit again, a day or even an hour after they've left. Aernout Van Lynden, Sky News, Visoko, central Bosnia. With decorum, if not with great ceremony, the mortal remains of Paul Goodall leave central Bosnia. Soldiers of the Coldstream Guards placing the body of the 35-year-old ODA driver in an armoured ambulance, which will take it on to a waiting helicopter for the beginning of the long flight home. Goodall was shot in cold blood last Thursday by 3 men the Bosnian government now say were foreign Muslim radicals. All 3 died in a shootout near Sarajevo on Monday. As a 3rd British victim of this conflict departs, 2 mining engineers from Yorkshire continue their ODA mission in Bosnia. They're here to help keep the coal mines open and the power stations running. The mine at Breza is less than a kilometre from Serb lines. It's been shelled and severely damaged, but production has never ceased.
Amazed in some cases, yes. Yeah. I mean, you only need to look round the place to see that it's taking a lot of initiative and a lot of dedication just to keep going. Like Breza's never stopped producing at all.
Down in the dark and dusty galleries, the magnitude of the task the ODA engineers face soon becomes apparent. Safety is a constant concern. Timber beams that have taken the place of sterner props have often buckled, and a lack of spare parts has turned much of the machinery into scrap metal.
70% of the hydraulic components are of this nature, in that they're beyond repair.
That's not stopped the miners of Breza cutting the coal out by hand, by drill and by machine. But production has dropped alarmingly.
Throughout the war raging 300 metres above us, and despite the proximity of the Serb front line, Breza mine has always continued working. But that is now endangered because the Croat forces won't allow the spare parts the ODA has brought for the mine through to Breza.
Over 1,000 tons of equipment is stuck in Adriatic ports because the Croats refuse to regard it as humanitarian aid. For the engineers from Yorkshire, it's now their biggest struggle. It's a part of the madness of this war. Croats, Serbs and Muslims alike get electricity produced from Breza's coal. Yet the Serbs have shelled it and the Croats are now strangling it from afar. Aernout Van Lynden, Sky News, Breza, central Bosnia. Aernout Van Lynden for CBS News at the Breza mine in central Bosnia.
The single shot entered the back of the Land Rover and passed through the left shoulder of the driver. He's in a stable condition and he's being transported up here to the medical team that we have in Vitez.
The soldier was driving a thin-skinned Land Rover through Gornji Vakuf, a town which has been bitterly contested for over a year by Croats and Muslims, and where a year ago Britain's UN contingent took its only fatal casualty so far, Lance Corporal Wayne Edwards. With the town still divided in Croat and Muslim halves, any drive through Gornji Vakuf is dangerous, and the British battalion gives every vehicle an escort of 2 warrior armoured personnel carriers. But even that is no defence against a single well-aimed round.
As far as we're aware, it was from the HVO, the Croat side.
That's been the case in several incidents in central Bosnia throughout the past week. Croat soldiers opening fire on Dutch and Canadian aid convoys and British military vehicles. More substantially, Croatia proper has this week been accused by the UN of sending its own army into neighbouring Bosnia. At a hastily convened press conference, the commander of the Bosnian Army's 3rd Corps, Mehmed Alagic, claimed over 8,000 soldiers from Croatia have already been sent in as reinforcements in an attempt to break the deadlock in central Bosnia. Proof was at hand in the form of documents found on captured and killed enemy and in the appearance of this man, Ivica Jäger, a 27-year-old waiter from Osijek in northeastern Croatia, captured at Gornji Vakuf a few days ago. He said he was called up by the army in Osijek on January the 7th.
Nama su rekli 7.1. ove godine da ćemo ići na vojnu.
We were told that we were only going on an exercise, but we were bused all the way to Gornji Vakuf.
Ima jako mali postotak dobrovoljaca. Ovo drugo.
There is a very small number of volunteers, but most of the others have been brought in against their will.
Such testimony could prove highly damaging to the Croatian government. The precedent has already been set. Sanctions imposed on Serbia for its involvement in the Bosnian War. And on Monday, European Union foreign ministers will discuss imposing the same sanctions, now on Croatia. Aernout Van Lynden, Sky News, Central Bosnia. The Vlasic Mountains in central Bosnia. It's a desolate place, its homes broken, villages deserted, populated only by men in uniform. The Serbs hold the high ground, these men of the Bosnian army the valley. They man a front line that has been static for months, where the snipers fight a sporadic, long-range war. Yet for 26-year-old Samir Sivac, these trenches are a sort of freedom. For 18 months he was incarcerated in the infamous camps of the Serbs, in Omarska, Trnopolje, Batkovici, held by his former Serb neighbours, just like thousands of other Muslims.
The camps were horrible, especially Omarska. On the first night, the Serbs put me with 160 others in a garage of just 20 square meters, with only one small window open. 5 died. You see, they locked us in and wouldn't let us open another window. They only fed us every 48 hours, but the beatings were more regular. They occurred every night. I prayed to God they would kill me or that I would die, rather than the suffering continue.
It ended when he was exchanged in September last year. Like hundreds of thousands of others, his family had been ethnically cleansed, now live as refugees scattered across the face of Europe. Samir didn't flee, but joined the Bosnian Army's 17th Brigade. It is unique, a brigade formed solely by the dispossessed. They all come from northwestern Bosnia, and all have lost their homes. All their families are refugees or have been murdered, and practically all have been in the camps.
We are like brothers here, each other's family. This brigade is our home.
They are men of few words, their card games largely silent, but for the music on the radio. Men who share a common past and a common goal, who refuse to accept their country's division.
I would never accept it. Our region is not Serb. It belongs to all of us, Serb, Croat, Muslim. It can't belong to only one.
They know the prospect is for more war, more destruction, more death. no longer are afraid of it.
I don't think about death at all. I've already been between life and death so often in the camps, on the very verge of death. I have grown accustomed to it.
Yet another ministerial visit to a war that continues to baffle, embarrass and divide the Western powers. British Defence Secretary Malcolm Rifkin, for a short time getting away from the briefings by senior commanders to talk to the soldiers, actually manning the armed escorts of the aid convoys, and getting caught ankle deep in the mud doing so. For Mr. Rifkin, the timing of this visit was unfortunate. Apart from backing the largely ineffective humanitarian aid effort, the Defence Secretary has always stressed his and the British government's opposition to any direct action to halt this war. Not for the first time, that policy has been left in tatters by a single, well-aimed mortar round.
Yes.
Mr. Rifkin did not rule out another ultimatum to the Serbs or even limited airstrikes against their positions, but he made clear Britain would continue to resist any change in the mandate of the UN forces here.
What UNPROFOR is doing under General Rhodes is demonstrating that within the mandate it is possible to ensure that the aid gets through without all the frustrations that have been seen in the past. There will always be difficulties. UNPROFOR is not here in a combat role, and there's no intention of changing that particular factor.
That said, the Defence Secretary departed for home across the potholed track the UN calls Route Diamond, only stopping briefly in Gornji Vakuf, where the houses no longer have roofs and where the British base straddles the front line between the Croat and Bosnian government forces. As a result, it sporadically gets hit, last Friday by 5 rockets fired by the Croats. On that occasion, there were no casualties, but for the moment, the soldiers, rather like the people of Sarajevo, remain incapable of mounting an effective response. Aernout Van Lynden, Sky News, Vitez, Central Bosnia. On a cold, miserable day, these front lines appear to belong to some distant former time. But this is the reality of Sarajevo. Discarded bullet cases in pools of mud, in gun emplacements which, even through the fog, have the city streets clearly in their sights. Despite the outcry that has followed Saturday's market atrocity, the Serbs manning these vantage points say they are not afraid. Like their leaders, they dismiss the tragedy as a self-inflicted hoax.
So many casualties from a single mortar bomb. Science fiction. It doesn't even happen in the movies.
Nor, after countless empty threats of Western intervention, do they believe the West will start bombing them now.
I think the Muslims will in the end have to be satisfied with what we are offering them, because they'll realize these threats of intervention are empty, it won't happen.
In Grbavica, the one part of Sarajevo's inner city in Serb hands, it's a relatively quiet day. But the streets are deserted, no one taking any chances. In the apartment blocks that are now the sole domain of soldiers, the talk is of possible intervention, and the response unanimous.
Whoever intervenes against us is our enemy. We'll treat them as our enemy and we'll hit them as hard as we can.
With a confidence that mirrors their military supremacy, every Serb fighter we've spoken to has told us they will refuse to make any concessions, stand fast against any ultimatum, and retaliate against any intervention from the air. After the ceasefire agreement struck at Sarajevo airport, the likelihood of such intervention has again waned. Yet the airport deal is meagre, and even before it was announced, Serb leader Radovan Karadzic pointed out the flaws in any forced withdrawal of heavy weaponry.
What weaponry, 30 kilometers, what with those which have a range much longer than 30 kilometers? There are many weaponry that they can reach more than 30 kilometers.
If they ask you to withdraw within that radius, would you therefore do it, or would you say no to them?
Well, we are just talking about partial peace for Sarajevo and putting Sarajevo under UN administration. We have been talking a few weeks about that, not in the occasion of this tragedy. And we are ready to consider this possibility.
In theory, the latest umpteenth ceasefire should help the forthcoming round of negotiations in Geneva, but the soldiers and civilians on both sides of Sarajevo's urban battlefield are unlikely to hold out any hope. They've seen it all before. Aernout Van Lynden, Sky News, Pale, Eastern Bosnia. In a small office in the Bosnian Serb heartland, a small press conference is held to issue the first counter-threats in reply to the rather larger threats made by NATO on Wednesday evening. The deputy commander of the Bosnian Serb army saying all aid workers will be held in Bosnian Serb territory if NATO carries out its threatened bombardment of Serb heavy weaponry.
If their countries bomb us, then these aid workers will stay with us.
Every day, UN convoys pass through Serb lines, some to bring food and medicine to the various Muslim enclaves, others to resupply UN forces. All the larger aid organizations have offices in Bosnian Serb territory. Senior aid officials have told Sky News they don't believe the Bosnian Serbs would carry out their threat, that the Serbs are bluffing in an attempt to dissuade NATO from acting. But General Gvero and other Serb leaders are adamant their borders will close and anyone caught inside will be held if NATO bombers strike against them. Just behind Serb front lines, French UN troops have been deploying to the most sensitive points around Sarajevo. It's part of the verbal ceasefire agreement reached on Wednesday and part of a delicate game of two-way Balkan bluff poker. General Gvero and the other Bosnian Serb leaders not ruling out compliance with the NATO ultimatum, but setting their own conditions.
We are not opposed to putting our artillery under UN control, but in that case Muslim artillery too has to be put under UN control. And additionally, we demand that Muslim infantry is also put under UN control, because they have 50,000 soldiers in Sarajevo.
Such demands are likely to be swept aside, but new attempts at stalling or fudging the issue are certain to continue to be made, right up to the end of NATO's 10-day ultimatum. Aernout Van Lynden, Sky News, Pale, Eastern Bosnia. Aernout Van Lynden for CBS News in Pale, Eastern Bosnia. Officially, the UNHCR say they are only pulling their 8 representatives, based in various parts of Bosnian Serb territory, out for consultation. The reality is a little different. It's a full-scale withdrawal ordered because of fears of what the Bosnian Serbs might do to them if NATO carries out its threatened airstrikes. On Thursday, the deputy commander of the Bosnian Serb army had already warned that all aid workers would be held if his artillery positions were bombed, and within the next 24 hours, the UNHCR should have vacated their villa in Pale, the mountain resort the Bosnian Serbs now call their capital. Out on the Serb front lines surrounding Sarajevo, the UN's troops are trying not to take too much notice of the Serb threats. Just a day after their deployment at what the UN calls sensitive points, these French Marines busily constructing some cover from the bitter cold. The French are there to try to ensure that Wednesday's verbal ceasefire agreement holds. Sporadically, it's already been broken, and the Serb fighters have few doubts it will break down completely.
It should be respected, but our past experience tells us it won't be respected.
Few believe this ceasefire has any more chance of success than all the others that went before. But it is now at the heart of the intricate political manoeuvres by all sides in the countdown to NATO's 10-day deadline, with Serbs, Bosnians and the UN trying to gauge if the others are bluffing or are serious. It's a dangerous game that for the moment remains delicately balanced. It brings with it the novel sight of UN guns trained on Sarajevo, but may in 8 days' time lead to the equally novel step of the West finally using its weaponry to try and end a 22-month-old siege of a European capital. Aernout Van Lynden, Sky News, Pale, Eastern Bosnia. Aernout Van Lynden for CBS News in Pale, Eastern Bosnia. The ceasefire may be holding and French soldiers patrolling the Serb front lines, but the negotiations on the demilitarization of Sarajevo have stalled. A demand by UNPROFOR for heavy weaponry to be handed over to the UN at Sarajevo airport was accepted with alacrity by the Bosnian government, but rejected by the leader of the Serb military negotiating team.
UNPROFOR
has proposed a new plan, but it is unacceptable to us. This new plan is the first step in implementing the NATO ultimatum, so we refuse to discuss it.
Colonel Kosovac told us the matter is now being examined by the Bosnian Serb leadership, and a formal reply will be given to the UN, probably by the Serb Chief of Staff, General Milovanovic, at a new round of talks on Sunday. UNPROFOR put forward a three-phase plan for the next 7 days, in line with the timetable set by the NATO ultimatum. By the evening of the 18th of February, the UN wants the Serbs to have handed over a minimum of 120 tanks, 60 heavy artillery guns and 135 mortars. The demand from the Bosnian government side is more modest, just 6 tanks and 30 mortars. The Serbs are almost certain to stand by their initial rejection. Handing over their heavy weaponry to the UN would mean losing control over it permanently, an abhorrent idea to the Serbs, above all because it was their vast supremacy in arms which made their large territorial conquests in Bosnia possible. The Serbs have thus far refused to show any weaponry being withdrawn from the front lines, instead showing off a few rather antiquated anti-aircraft missiles that are unlikely to have much success should NATO carry out its threatened airstrikes. Yet they may be fired nonetheless if the UN stands by its demands and the Serbs stick to their rejection of them. Aernout Van Lynden, Sky News, Pale, Eastern Bosnia. Aernout Van Lynden of Sky News for CBS News in Pale, Eastern Bosnia. On a mountain road, an impromptu meeting of 2 UN generals. One, Brigadier Angus Ramsey, has just completed his negotiations with the Bosnian Serbs. The other, Brigadier Andrei Subiru, is about to continue them. There appears to be some optimism, yet both men are clearly on edge.
It's a little bit delicate, it's a little bit difficult. We're trying to save peace here.
The peace they're trying to save is Sarajevo's latest ceasefire, which has lasted longer than any other. But the real issue dividing the men at the table is NATO's demand for the withdrawal of all the Serb guns surrounding the Bosnian capital. On Saturday, the UN's plans for that withdrawal stalled and are now rejected out of hand by the Chief of Staff of the Bosnian Serb army.
There is no withdrawal of heavy weaponry. The weapons will stay where they are. We only accept that the weapons are monitored at their positions.
General Milovanovic claimed that Mr. Akashi, the UN Secretary-General's envoy to the former Yugoslavia, had accepted the Serb position, but this has been denied by the UN. Brigadier Subiru left the meeting stern-faced and refusing to comment, but knowing that a direct confrontation between the Serbs and NATO's air force has been brought much closer. With the failure of these top-level negotiations, it's now clear the Serbs will try to test NATO's resolve right up to the deadline. It's a dangerous game of brinkmanship, as for the first time in this war, NATO's credibility is now also fully on the line. Aernout Van Lynden, Sky News, Pale, Eastern Bosnia. Aernout Van Lynden of Sky News for CBS News in Pale, Eastern Bosnia. An idyllic setting, yet this is a war zone. Precisely 10 years ago, these slopes hosted the women's downhill and slalom of the 14th Winter Olympiad. Now these same mountains harbour the guns that for 22 months have besieged Sarajevo, guns NATO has demanded be withdrawn. Impervious to such details, the leaders of the Serbs of Bosnia come to Rajka Dolina, literally the Valley of Paradise, to open their own alternative Olympics. 5 days to go to the end of the NATO deadline, yet the message the Serbs are trying to send to the world is, crisis? What crisis? As if they're oblivious to the mounting pressures and the realities of the front lines just 15 kilometers from these former Olympic slopes. As opening ceremonies go, this is a modest affair. Only Serbs are competing, and only Serbs will win. Yet banned from the real Olympiad in Lillehammer, that is the calculated purpose. The odds are stacked in their favour. It's almost a metaphor of this war. And from under their umbrellas, the Serb leaders exude defiance. The Speaker of the Bosnian Serb Parliament once again rejecting NATO's ultimatum and exhorting the small group of competitors to compete as fiercely against each other as they have done against their foes. Nodding approvingly, Radovan Karadzic and his wife look on as a flame is lit and as the Olympic rings are raised, albeit to the Serb rather than the Olympic anthem. And then, with an air of unconcern, the Bosnian Serb leader dismisses questions of war and peace.
We do not deal with NATO ultimatum. We are dealing with United Nations. We have already agreed our weaponry to be controlled by United Nations. What do you expect?
That response has not yet satisfied NATO, and if the Serbs stick to their guns, their alpine tranquility so close to Sarajevo's siege could be resoundingly shattered in just a matter of a few short days. Aernout Van Lynden, Sky News, Pale, Eastern Bosnia. Aernout Van Lynden of Sky News for CBS News in Pale, Eastern Bosnia. Mid-morning and the Bosnian Serb Council of War meets in Pale. The smiles are not just for the cameras. They believe the latest Western threat against them is receding, like all the others did before. By mid-afternoon, Radovan Karadzic faces the press to issue what has become the daily refrain of the Serb leadership.
We are dealing with the United Nations, not with NATO. We are happy with the high officials of the United Nations, and we trust them. They are impartial.
Which is certainly not Mr. Karadzic's view of NATO.
All those threats made by NATO are done because of internal NATO's problems. This is a mastodont organization which does not have any reason to exist any longer.
It is through compromise agreements with the local UN commanders that the Serbs believe they found a way round NATO's demands. Why should NATO strike from the air if the ceasefire in Sarajevo is still holding? The deployment of UN troops along the front lines also serves the purposes of the Serbs, legitimizing their hold over parts of the Bosnian capital. And in answer to NATO's central demand for a withdrawal of all Serb heavy weaponry, Dr. Karadzic said he and the UN had come up with an acceptable deal on monitoring the heavy guns.
Although we have agreed it to be controlled on site, we are ready to regroup it, to make it, to decrease the number of positions in order to make it much easier to United Nations to control. Certainly we should withdraw some weaponry because now it's all sufficient, since there are not going to be fights in area of Sarajevo, and we may need those pieces elsewhere.
If the UN accepts this position, both sides have made a concession, not in line with NATO's ultimatum, a prospect that clearly pleases the Serb leader. The Serb strategy, in answer to NATO's ultimatum, has been to try and drive a wedge between the UN's forces on the ground and NATO's leadership in Brussels, agreeing to the watered-down proposals of the one while refusing to pay any attention to the demands and ultimatum of the other. It's a strategy that's working, and it's now clear the Serbs are confident this crisis can be diffused. Aernout Van Lynden, Sky News, Pale, Eastern Bosnia. Day 6 of Sarajevo's ceasefire, and on the front line by the bridge of brotherhood and unity, French UN soldiers stand guard, unconcerned and relaxed. The UN's plan is working. It does not lift the siege of the Bosnian capital, just silences the guns and turns the devastation of a front line into a makeshift frontier. Not far from those French soldiers, Bashir Karakash tends his arthritic feet. He's a Muslim who survived living alone in Grbavica, the district of Sarajevo held by the Serbs. A man delighted with silence.
When they were shooting, I was running around trying to find some cover in this flat. I didn't have tranquilizers. Now it's different. Now I can sleep again.
While the old rest, the young come out to play games which war made impossible for 22 months. Grbavica never suffered like the rest of Sarajevo. There was no hunger here, but the danger of sniper fire was constant. And the peace now is still too novel and precarious to bring many out onto streets, still dominated by gunmen and heavy weaponry. Those who do venture out come in search for food at the few small private kiosks. The wares are not abundant and the prices are in scarce Deutschmarks and dollars, but it is a semblance of normality.
I hope that this is the end of the war. It's high time. I've had enough. We never imagined it could last this long.
Nearby, other troops of the UN are bringing food. Until now, they came just 3 times a week. But if the ceasefire holds, they'll be here permanently. For the UN, the next priority is to deploy more forces to areas like Grbavica, a move which would strengthen the ceasefire and keep NATO's threatened airstrikes at bay. The UN essentially reinforcing the status quo rather than disrupting it by bombing the Serbs. For the moment, the UN's convoys have other uses. They don't just bring sustenance from America, but also wooden pallets, which sawn up will bring warmth, and plastic sheeting that will cover up window panes lost in war. Aernout Van Lynden, Sky News, Sarajevo. Russia's Vitaly Churkin called it a peace initiative, but in essence this was a face-saving operation, the Russians requesting what NATO had demanded, and the Bosnian Serbs finally agreeing to comply.
We have accepted the proposal and request of Russia concerning withdrawal of heavy weaponry. We do think that the war in Sarajevo is finally over.
A view immediately echoed by his Russian guest.
I think that we are moving towards peace in and around Sarajevo. I know that the Serb heavy weaponry is going to be withdrawn. I know that there is peace now in Sarajevo. Nobody is shelling people in Sarajevo, and it should stay that way.
No details on the how and when of the withdrawal were given, and this crisis will only be averted definitively when we see the Serbian guns tunneled out of the 12-mile exclusion zone. 8 hours before the arrival of Russia's Deputy Foreign Minister, optimism among senior UN officers was already plain to see on the deal they, rather than the Russians, had previously made with the Serbs. The Sarajevo sector commander, Brigadier Subiru, saying step-by-step progress was being made in getting the Serb artillery under control. The contrast in mood with his Serb opposite number was startling. After 22 months of war, Serb generals clearly unfamiliar with the art of compromise and concessions. For the first time, their subordinates allowed us to film some of the heavy weaponry withdrawn to barracks, although these tanks and armoured cars are not yet under UN control and remain just a few hundred metres from Sarajevo's front lines. While most of the Serb guns remain hidden from view, their finest infantry were on display for a visit by the so-called president of Serb Krajina, the regions of Croatia captured by the Serbs in the war of 1991. UN forces already keep a brittle peace there, and it is from that territory that the Russians will be sending 400 of their blue helmets to patrol Sarajevo's precarious truce, a truce that now appears unlikely to be shattered by NATO intervention from the air. Aernout Van Lynden, Sky News, Pale, Eastern Bosnia. The armour of 22 months of siege is finally withdrawing. The first Serb tanks, armoured cars, mortars and multiple rocket launchers trundling through the snow away from Sarajevo. A Serb colonel confirms the orders from his supreme command, saying the guns will now take up what he calls new firing positions on other battlefronts. At the Serbs' Lukovica barracks, just a few hundred metres from Sarajevo's front lines, the UN civilian and military commanders arrive for a new round of negotiations. Worried faces exposing how delicate Sarajevo's peace still is. Conspicuous by their absence are the Serbs' most senior generals, who in the past always declined to compromise. And agreement is reached. Before NATO's deadline expires, the Serb heavy weaponry will either be withdrawn altogether or be collected at so-called regroupment points within the 12-mile exclusion zone.
Starting tomorrow noon, the UNPROFOR armed elements will be controlling the 7 sites where these Serb weapons, heavy arms, will be grouped.
And the Serb leader acknowledges he's bowed to the demand.
We have been withdrawing already convoys and convoys, and we will withdraw even more. Those which can't be withdrawn because of snow would be under full effective control of the United Nations.
Dr. Karadzic also promising the whole operation will be completed 24 hours before NATO's deadline expires.
I've been encouraged by what I heard today. There's been total cooperation on both sides. Everybody appears to be complying with the conditions that we've laid down, and I maintain cautious optimism.
General Rose has made no secret of his hope that the success of the UN's plans in Sarajevo can be repeated elsewhere in Bosnia. For the moment, such hopes are premature. The tanks and armoured cars that are now moving are more likely to be engaged in new offensives once the snow disappears.
Everything now points to NATO's deadline passing without incident, without the need for intervention. The mould has been cast in Sarajevo, but it's unlikely to be copied anytime soon in the rest of Bosnia. Aernout Van Lynden, Sky News at the Lukovica barracks near Sarajevo. The Grbavica junction, its one entrance into Sarajevo, now turned into an exit from the front lines for these Serb tanks and armoured cars. The armour is manned by soldiers looking glum, carrying out orders that are clearly unpopular. Most do not see it as a withdrawal, but rather as a retreat. This soldier saying he's furious, that unlike his leaders, he would never have negotiated with the enemy. Yet despite such vocal resentment, the commands are being followed. Under the observant eye of the UN, the Serbs for once appearing to stick to their word. Although their pledge to have finished the withdrawal 24 hours ahead of NATO's deadline seems to have got stuck in the snow. All across the hillsides, convoys are held up. The Serbs are citing the exceptionally heavy recent snowfall as an excuse for much of their delayed withdrawal. It's not an argument that cuts any ice with the UN. As one officer puts it, they've had 10 days to move. If they don't move on time, it'll be their problem. For a time, the crisis turned almost to farce. With the cameras of the world's media far outnumbering the weaponry, the Serbs were withdrawing. And when the journalistic hordes were finally admitted into one hangar of the Lukovica barracks, all that awaited them was a rather motley collection of rusting mortars, artillery and anti-aircraft guns. Such disorganization is typical of the Serbs. Yet as NATO's deadline approaches, the evidence of the convoys on the hillsides points to the Serbs finally realizing the threat is serious. Aernout Van Lynden, Sky News, Pale, Eastern Bosnia. One o'clock in the morning and a column of Serb trucks is still stuck halfway up Mount Jahorina. They're heading east away from Sarajevo, out of the exclusion zone. The faces are angry, made angrier by drink. These Serb soldiers say they're engaged in a retreat rather than a withdrawal. It leaves them humiliated. Lack of fuel has left one driver of a T-55 tank stuck further up the mountain. He's able to get a lift as yet another column of armour and artillery inch their noisy way to new positions. Nocturnal processions provide some unlikely sights, like this soldier asleep on the deck of his armoured car in temperatures way below zero. By this time, the Serbs had pledged to withdraw all their weaponry. The snows have delayed them, but the fact that they're still moving in the dead of night is proof of how seriously the fast-approaching deadline is taken. Earlier in the evening, the advance party of 400 Russian UN troops, redeployed from Croatia to Sarajevo, arrived in the Serb-held outskirts. They're welcomed with open arms by their traditional allies, but can expect a frosty welcome on the other Bosnian side of the front line. Yet such reinforcements are crucial if the UN is to fulfill its new role as a disengagement force, straddling the front lines of Sarajevo and securing the permanence of the ceasefire. As the Serb withdrawal got into gear yesterday, dozens of UN troops were already spread across the hillsides, monitoring the pullout. Several hundred more will be deployed as permanent armed guards over the guns the Serbs have brought back to barracks, an operation brought about by a threat that NATO now does not look likely to have to carry out. Aernout Van Lynden, Sky News, Pale, Eastern Bosnia.
It may not prove to be the end of its war, but for the moment at least, this Serb T-55 tank and its crew are being made redundant. With the skies finally clearing, the Serbs driving it into a so-called regroupment point manned by UN soldiers in the eastern hills overlooking Sarajevo. The French soldiers only arrived the previous day and are still busily clearing the snow and constructing some cover in inhospitable terrain. They recognize that despite their rather meagre haul of mostly antiquated guns, they would be hostages in Serb territory should NATO still decide to bomb. That now appears unlikely. Few weapons may have been handed over within the 12-mile exclusion zone, but UN officers confirmed the Serbs had withdrawn all their biggest and most effective guns outside it. And as NATO's deadline drew nearer, the UN was not beyond giving a helping hand, so that their men could lay their hands on as many barrels as possible, whatever the caliber. The arrival of other UN forces within the Serb heartland leads to celebration rather than resigned retreat. 400 Russian UN reinforcements greeted almost as saviors by their allies of old. Their numbers may be modest, but the Serbs read much into the appearance of the Russians, a guarantee of safety from Muslim offensives and airstrikes alike. At the military barracks outside the exclusion zone, such welcomes are more muted. Here, only unarmed UN military observers can watch over the former guns of siege. And while the number of weapons is also small, here too we get confirmation that the menace of possible airstrikes has worked, that the Serb armour has gone to other battlefronts.
Just 10 days after the Western Alliance finally issued an effective threat, Sarajevo's predicament has significantly changed. Proof, if proof were needed, that only the language of force is heeded here, and begging the question why the West hasn't spoken it before. Aernout Van Lynden, Sky News, at the Mokro barracks in eastern Bosnia.
Midnight Greenwich Mean Time, H-hour around Sarajevo. In the freezing hills to the east of the Bosnian capital, a few French UN soldiers patrol regroupment point Golf Papa 1, while others sleep in armoured personnel carriers. NATO's deadline passes without incident, without airstrikes. And while UN soldiers watch over the Serb heavy weaponry they've collected, their Serb counterparts relax inside warm barracks with copious amounts of drink. As if to taunt the Western powers, other Serbs go out to ski on former Olympic slopes to prove they're not afraid, that they can still enjoy the good life. At Pali's tiny radio station, the mood is less jovial. They're up all night with a special program entitled Waiting for It. It doesn't happen. And earlier in the day, while NATO jets flew overhead, the Serbs on Mount Trebovic overlooking Sarajevo were already preparing for a feast. The Serbs have a history of celebrating defeat. On this occasion, it's only a partial one. Despite their public bravura, they've largely complied with the demands of NATO and removed most of their guns surrounding Sarajevo. Yet the siege of the Bosnian capital has not been lifted, and the Serbs played the game right up to the wire, only pulling their armour and artillery out during the last 48 hours, and then citing the heavy snows as an excuse for any delay. The UN, clearly anxious to avoid any intervention from the air, in the end even gave the Serbs a helping hand, pulling this artillery piece into one of their regroupment points. Their haul at these tiny UN compounds has been largely symbolic. Lighter and older weapons, while the newest and biggest guns were pulled out of the exclusion zone to other battlefronts where Bosnia's war continues.
Publicly, the Serbs are likely to crow about a victory, but privately, the mood here in the Serb headquarters of Pale is one of relief. On this occasion, they know the threat from the West was real, and that it came very close to being carried out. Aernout Van Lynden, Sky News, Pale, eastern Bosnia.
Serb guns and armour litter the northern hills above Sarajevo, as if left by an army in retreat. Some of the armour has careered off the road, its entire tracks are ripped off. Other pieces, like this 40mm Bofors gun, have simply been abandoned. Clear evidence that the day after NATO's deadline expired, much of this former weaponry of 22 months siege is not under UN control. At Poljane, one of the Serbs' main artillery positions, French UN troops only arrive at midday to set up a permanent base. Their commander displeased to find us there.
Actuellement sur ma position, équipe de journalistes, Sky News.
The welcome from the locals is more hospitable. The Serb commander, who's nicknamed the Beast, consummating a new era in Serb-UN relations with plum brandy, before showing off his hardware to his UN opposite number. That hardware is considerable. 6 120mm mortars with hundreds of rounds of ammunition, 5 artillery pieces, and not to mention various smaller bits of weaponry strewn around the hillsides. In the early afternoon, the first UN helicopters ever to fly around Sarajevo appear. They deliver UNPROFOR's head of civilian affairs and a delegation of officers, clearly uneasy about the delays.
We're visiting these regrouping sites. There's still a lot to be done.
That's a Portuguese understatement. And the UN's present predicament in the hills surrounding the Bosnian capital shows how premature their hopes are of permanent peace. The UN civilian and military commanders speak of extending the peace they've established in Sarajevo to the rest of Bosnia. But the problems they've encountered collecting the weaponry just within a 20-kilometre exclusion zone underlines how difficult that task will be. To clear the hillsides, the UN are themselves dragging off whatever they can find. But it now seems crystal clear it may be some time yet before they've found it all. Aernout Van Lynden, Sky News, Poljane, north of Sarajevo. Serb guns under British guard. By the hamlet of Krivoglavci, a platoon of the Coldstream Guards watch over 1 mortar and 7 Bofors 40mm guns. It's not an impressive haul, but that's the case at practically all the 8 collecting points the UN forces have set up within Serb lines around Sarajevo. The Guards only arrived at the position they called Tango 30 2 days earlier. They're still busily constructing a razor wire stockade adjacent to a cemetery, digging in their warrior armoured personnel carriers and becoming accustomed to life in the mud and snow away from the amenities of the main Coldstream base at Vitez. Small teams are sent to reconnoitre the nearby hills, and that is where the problems lie. Just above the little base, under the direct gaze of 2 UNMOs, military observers, Serb soldiers getting ready to move 1 of 6 light artillery pieces out of the exclusion zone. But that's no longer allowed.
Any weapon in a collecting point now must stay there.
Undaunted, the Serbs drive off. The UNMOs don't stop them, but the Coldstream Guards do, leaving Serbs and Englishmen eyeing each other warily, guns at hand.
The local Serb commander here has wished to move 3 of his artillery pieces from the position they're at now, outside of the exclusion zone. I have had orders come through on the UNMO chain of command and on the military chain of command that he is not allowed to move these weapons.
Negotiations follow, the Serbs saying they will, the British saying they can't. Incidents such as this one have been typical of the UN operation in and around Sarajevo, with the UN High Command only making it clear today that the Serb guns can no longer be moved out of the exclusion zone. Into the stalemate of Krivoglavci walks Lieutenant General Sir Michael Rose. The UNPROFOR commander in Bosnia had come to inspect his troops, but now finds himself embroiled in yet another negotiation, as NATO jets patrol high overhead and UN helicopters monitor any Serb movement from closer to the ground. The general is firm.
Any inside the collecting one's got to come into the... we realise that.
The gun stays in the compound, will be joined by the 5 other pieces still hidden on the hill. One incident resolved, but there are likely to be many more before all the Serb guns are firmly caged in by UN wire. Aernout Van Lynden, Sky News, Krivoglavci, north of Sarajevo. Three days after NATO's deadline expired, more evidence that the UN has not been able to force the Serbs to meet NATO's demands. By the road into Osijek, the Serb guns are still in position, their ammunition at hand. There are UN forces in this little northwestern suburb of Sarajevo. They're meant to control the guns, but they don't. A hapless platoon of Britain's Coldstream Guards has been in Osijek since Saturday, but the Serbs have refused to hand over 19 mortars and field guns. And on Tuesday they even moved 4 pieces, 3 120mm mortars and 1 mountain gun, out of the exclusion zone against the direct orders of the UN High Command. The predicament of the British platoon here in Osijek is typical of the position the UN now finds itself in. They're engaged in a hardly subtle yet deeply embarrassing game of hide-and-seek with the Serb forces, which for the moment at least, the Serbs would appear to be winning. In Osijek, it's left the UN armour huddled together by a crossroads, in flagrant violation of the basic laws of the military in the field, certainly in a war zone, with the men largely idle, left to laze in the sun or watch the cargo planes ferrying the aid into Sarajevo, while their coils of razor wire remain redundant, their position undefended.
We had just arrived and there's 4 warriors and an engineer variant turning up on their doorstep, and there was no physical tension or stress, but that you could feel there was a lot of tension in the air, but that has decreased over the last couple of days.
Serb villagers and soldiers with idiosyncratic headgear still stop by to gaze at the novel sight of the British soldiers. Lieutenant Martin continues to negotiate with the local commander, just as both men's superiors are doing elsewhere, but up to now, to no avail. The guns remain in Serb hands, and all the UN soldiers can do is watch. Aernout Van Lynden, Sky News, Osijek, north of Sarajevo. For 16 months they monitored the skies above central Bosnia. Now at dawn they struck. NATO jets shooting down 4 Serb Galip G4 planes as they attacked 2 Bosnian arms factories. An unprecedented act in NATO's 45-year-old history, and the first direct intervention from the West in the 23 months of the Bosnian War. The no-fly zone has been repeatedly violated by both the Serbs and the Croats, but never on such a scale. 6 of these Galips, light ground attack aircraft, refusing to heed the orders of the American pilots and paying the price. The Serb response was to shell Tuzla, specifically targeting its airport, which has been closed throughout the conflict, but which the UN wants to reopen by March the 7th. The indications here in Sarajevo point to a Serb preemptive attack, striking at arms factories in anticipation of a major Bosnian spring offensive, which for the first time in over a year could see Bosnian and Croat forces united against the Serbs. Last week, an initial agreement brought a hesitant halt to the bitter war between the Bosnian and Croat troops in the centre of the country. But if that deal firms up, the Serbs would find themselves the sole target of forces better led and equipped than at any previous time. NATO's intervention in the air did not affect Sarajevo's ceasefire, but the UN did halt its helicopter and its aid flights, and its so-called confidence-building measures on the ground also hit an obstacle. In the hope of finally being able to cross the front lines of siege, dozens of Sarajevans had gathered at the inappropriately named Bridge of Brotherhood and Unity. From behind the barricades of war, they watched General Sir Michael Rose stride out onto the bridge, but his hopes and theirs of reopening it were dashed by Serb demands for written agreements. Yet for the General this was just a hitch, and he did not believe NATO's downing of Serb jets would affect Sarajevo's precarious lull.
And I don't believe that it would have the slightest effect on what we're doing here, which of course is feeding 2.7 million people in central Bosnia and trying to establish a peace process which hitherto has gone well over the last 14 days.
Yet Sarajevo remains besieged, its inhabitants cut off, and the events in the air above central Bosnia have underlined that this war is still far from over. Aernout Van Lynden, Sky News, Sarajevo. For the UN's commander in Bosnia, these are times of hope, but also of frustration. General Sir Michael Rose arriving at the British battalion's headquarters in Vitez, knowing that while the brittle ceasefire in Sarajevo is holding, and a new truce has been signed by the warring Bosnian and Croat forces in the centre of the country, the major Western powers are refusing or reluctant to send him more troops. It's a setback.
We need to interpose troops, we need to collect weapons and control them. And we need to be able to react to violations of the ceasefire. And of course, if one can't do those things, and we do have something now like 400 kilometres of conflict line to do these things, then there is a danger that the whole peace process will unravel.
The official mandate of the UN contingent in Bosnia is only as the armed escorts of the humanitarian aid convoys. But General Rose is now trying to turn them into peacekeepers. Already he's deployed French and British platoons around Sarajevo as part of a disengagement force, and to guard the Serb heavy weaponry they're still finding within the 20-kilometre exclusion zone almost 2 weeks after NATO's deadline expired. More precarious still is the truce agreed to in central Bosnia. For over a year it was the scene of bitter fighting between the Bosnian and Croat forces. That's now stopped, but for the past 2 days one British unit based near the town of Žepče has come under direct mortar fire. Reason enough for General Rose to reiterate an old threat.
It's an extremely complex area there where you have three sides involved in a three-cornered fight, if you like, and it's extremely difficult to distinguish one side from the other there, particularly with mortars. You're never quite sure where the mortars have been fired from. But certainly, if there were people flagrantly engaging my troops, and the only way of dealing with them was with airstrikes, I would have no hesitation at all in calling down airstrikes.
Yet given the initial success he's had, airstrikes are the last thing the General will want to order. They would shatter the confidence he's trying to build up with all the warring parties. A confidence that might survive in Sarajevo, but is likely to be shattered by long-expected spring offensives elsewhere, unless the UN has the men at its disposal to step in and separate the forces. Aernout Van Lynden, Sky News, Sarajevo. months they patrolled the skies above central Bosnia without firing. But now at dawn, they struck. NATO jets coming across the Serb plains as they attacked 2 Bosnian arms factories. Once in the American sights, the Serbs' Galeb G4s, light ground attack aircraft, stood no chance. It's an unprecedented act in NATO's 45-year-old history, and the first direct intervention from the West in the 23 months of the Bosnian War. But then the Serb attack on the arms factories at Novi Travnik and Bugojno was a flagrant violation of NATO's Operation Deny Flight over Bosnia. The factory at Novi Travnik, one of the main gun foundries of the former Yugoslavia, burnt long and hard, smoke billowing up into the skies, almost eclipsing the sun. It's a major loss for the Bosnian government, which throughout this war has been reliant on arms it could produce itself because of the UN's continued arms embargo. The Serb response to NATO's interception in the air was to shell Tuzla, specifically targeting its airport, which has been closed throughout the conflict, but which the UN wants to reopen within the next week. The indications here in Sarajevo point to a Serb preemptive attack, striking at arms factories in anticipation of a major Bosnian spring offensive, which for the first time in over a year could see Bosnian and Croat forces united against the Serbs. Last week, an initial agreement brought a hesitant halt to the bitter war between the Bosnian and Croat troops in the center of the country. But if that deal firms up, the Serbs would find themselves the sole target of forces better led and equipped than at any previous time. NATO's intervention in the air did not affect Sarajevo's ceasefire, but the UN did halt its helicopter and its aid flights, and its so-called confidence-building measures on the ground also hit an obstacle. In the hope of finally being able to cross the front lines of siege, dozens of Sarajevans had gathered at the inappropriately named Bridge of Brotherhood and Unity. From behind the barricades of war, they watched General Sir Michael Rose stride out onto the bridge, but his hopes and theirs of reopening it were dashed by Serb demands for written agreements. Yet for the General this was just a hitch, and he did not believe NATO's downing of Serb jets would affect Sarajevo's precarious lull.
I don't believe that it would have the slightest effect on what we're doing here, which of course is feeding 2.7 million people in central Bosnia and trying to establish a peace process which hitherto has gone well over the last 14 days.
Yet Sarajevo remains besieged, its inhabitants cut off, and the events in the air above central Bosnia have underlined that this war is still far from over. Aernout Van Lynden, Sky News, Sarajevo. Aernout Van Lynden of Sky News for CBS News, Sarajevo. At the emergency entrance to Sarajevo State Hospital, any arrival is met with the instincts of 23 months of siege. Yet these days, patients like 9-year-old Tarik Viteskic aren't wounded. He's cut his leg on a playground. Hardly an emergency. Tariq's been to the hospital before, 3 times before, with shrapnel wounds. Then they had to save his life. Now they just have to save his pride. In the operating theatres, the pace has also eased. For almost 2 years, they prayed for an end to the shelling, prayed for time. Now they've got it. Time for secondary operations, time to heal the wounds of war. For Chief Surgeon Abdullah Nakash, every day is a victory. Not only has his hospital survived, it survived with men and women like Ranko Chovic and Željko Knežević working alongside him. Serbs and Muslims together upholding Sarajevo's ancient traditions of coexistence in the midst of a medieval siege.
He is the key element, but the decisive factor was that the staff that stayed in the hospital did so, not because they had to, but because they decided to. We became tied to it as to a close relation, not as to some place of work.
Some close relation. For 23 months, this was their reality. A hospital court in the center of the city, just a few hundred meters from Serb lines. Itself a prime target, so often they gave up counting long ago. It had been the hospital of the Yugoslav People's Army. In May 1992, that army left, but the hospital didn't die. Sarajevans kept it alive. Every day, the rush through the doors of emergency, the rush to stem blood, extract jagged metal, save life. They yearn for calm, for the guns to fall silent, but now that they have, it's unsettled them, confused them.
I still can't believe this ceasefire is for real. I feel as if they are only regrouping. This immense silence makes me hallucinate. I dream of the sirens of ambulances. I dream of noise. The silence hurts. After all these shells, silence hurts.
But in the silence, they're taking stock. Dr. Bakir Nakash, the hospital's administrator, contemplating over 8,000 major operations. Proud of it, yet deeply concerned as to how they will rebuild and with what funds if the precarious lull turns to more permanent peace. A peace his brother, like all the staff, cannot yet grasp.
I fear this evil isn't over yet. We hope for the best, but we're still prepared for more misery. Yet, as the flow of wounded stops, I do see the first signs of relaxation. You feel it on yourself. And I'll tell you a little secret. During the last few days, I found myself walking to the top floors, just because suddenly I have the time on my hands.
In Sarajevo, like all the cities of the former Yugoslavia, smoking is not just a habit, more a way of life. A way of life that 23 months of siege hasn't destroyed, rather reinforced. Nicotine, the cheapest sedative, one that through good luck and some resilience always remained available. Like any other enterprise in the Bosnian capital, the tobacco factory has not escaped unscathed. But this is one Sarajevan production line war has not been able to close down. It simply moved underground. Their luck lay in a vast stock of bales of Macedonian tobacco leaf, one natural product that does not decay for years. Their resilience, as ever, that of its people, who even during the worst shelling would come to pitchfork the tobacco into the machines. Only a cut in electricity or fuel has ever halted them, but when the juice is running, the cigarettes roll. The ingenuity comes with the presentation. They ran out of packaging, so rolls of 50 cigarettes, locally nicknamed the multiple rocket launcher, are bound by beer labels. And the old communist libraries have been liberated. their doctrine spread to the masses in somewhat abridged manner. It's not just the turgid volumes of a discarded ideology that are used, but dictionaries, birth certificates, court records, even poetry. The packets may have lost their health warnings, but then in Sarajevo, the entire city has hazard written all over it. Aernout Van Lynden, Sky News, Sarajevo. The chief surgeon now stalks the corridors. His staff still operate. Yet in casualty, the drama has gone. Any arrival is met with the instincts of 23 months of siege. But 9-year-old Tarik Viteskic isn't wounded. He's cut his leg playing with friends. It's a nasty cut that's left him shaking, but hardly an emergency. Tarik's been here before, 3 times before, each time with shrapnel wounds. But then they had to save his life. Now they just have to save his pride. This is Sarajevo's State Hospital, a place where they prayed for an end to the shelling, prayed for time. The ceasefire has given it to them for the first time in almost 2 years. They still operate on the casualties of war, but these are secondary operations. And behind the mask, the surgeon sings. For Dr. Abdullah Nakash, every day is a victory. Not only has his hospital survived, it survived with men and women like Ranko Čović and Željka Knežević. Serbs who believe in coexistence, believe in Muslims, Croats and Serbs working and living together. That is Sarajevo's ancient tradition. That is what Dr. Nakash and his staff have upheld. That's what Sarajevo's State Hospital has become a symbol of.
We didn't stay here because we are professionals or because we thought we would learn more. We stayed because we are committed to our city, to this way of life.
A commitment that's had its price.
Not even in my darkest dreams could I have imagined what we have lived through these last 23 months. So much human misery, so much suffering and sorrow, so many deaths. I simply can't understand it. Sometimes it still seems a terrible dream.
But it was no dream. This was reality. A hospital court in the center of a city besieged, just a few hundred meters from the Serb lines. And itself a prime target, hit so often that they gave up counting long ago and turned it into a joke, the Swiss cheese hospital. It had been the hospital of the Yugoslav People's Army. On the 10th of May 1992, most of that army left, but the hospital didn't die. Sarajevans now kept it alive. Every day, the rush through the doors of emergency, the rush to stem blood, extract jagged metal, save life. Lecturers, trainees, assistants, who from one day to the next were forced to deal with traumatic surgery and became experts in it. They worked as one team, always with Abdullah Nakash at their center.
For us, he's an example of dedication, a man who commits all his being to medicine and to the ordinary people. He devotes all his emotion to his work, yet he's also a man who you can approach with any kind of request, from the simplest injury to the most complicated operation. He is the key element, but the decisive factor was that the staff that stayed in the hospital did so, not because they had to, but because they decided to. We became tied to it as to a close relation, not as to some place of work.
She's called Zenada Dedukic. She's a nurse at the state hospital, but today that is not her concern. She's visiting her father, Mehmet Dedukic. He's one of the 10,000 that now lie in Sarajevo's Lions Cemetery, a place where the cost of siege becomes apparent. This is what 2 years of siege means. 10,000 Serbs, Croats and Muslims buried side by side, mourned individually. Mehmet Dedukic was killed in the random manner so typical of this war, cut down by the front door of his apartment block. The rest of the family survives in Sarajevo style, confronting the deprivations of war with resilience and dignity, and some ingenuity. Zenada's nephews playing with trains run off a car battery, in rooms where plastic sheeting keeps the draft out, and where cooking gas has replaced electricity. The family is close-knit, yet it's the hospital that has sustained her. The Serbs may have tried to destroy it, but in her mind it became an impregnable fortress.
There is always fear. That's normal. As long as you feel fear, you are still normal. The hospital was hit so many times, yet the shells and bullets never stopped us there. And that gave us a strange sense of security. Only inside the hospital walls was I not afraid, but at home I have fear, and in the streets I still have fear, yet never in the hospital.
For the moment at least, the guns have ceased firing, but on his rounds, Dr. Nakash is still confronted by the pain of war. Its casualties still populate the intensive care wards. For them, this lull came too late. And for the staff, the sudden calm means the adrenaline on which they survived has gone as abruptly as a shell fire. It's a calm they've all yearned for, but that now that it's arrived, unsettles them.
I still can't believe this ceasefire is for real. I feel as if they are only regrouping. This immense silence makes me hallucinate. I dream of the sirens of ambulances. I dream of noise. The silence hurts. After all these shells, silence hurts.
But in the silence, they're taking stock. Dr. Bakir Nakash, the hospital's administrator, the singing surgeon's brother, contemplating a history of over 8,000 major operations, proud of it, but now concerned as to how to rebuild if this precarious lull turns to more permanent peace. A peace his brother, like all the staff, can't yet grasp.
I fear this evil isn't over yet. We hope for the best, but we're still prepared for more misery. Yet, as the flow of wounded stops, I do see the first signs of relaxation. You feel it in yourself. And I'll tell you a little secret. During the last few days, I found myself walking to the top floors, just because suddenly I have the time on my hands.